السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته طلبتنا الأعزاء. أهلا وسهلا بكم in lecture 7 about the temporomandibular joint. We study the temporomandibular joint because it is related closely to the construction of our complete denture. It is related to the occlusion of our complete denture. The lower arch is connected with the upper arches through the temporomandibular joint and through the occlusion between upper and lower teeth. So the joint, this temporomandibular joint, will affected by the occlusion between upper and lower teeth, and the occlusion between upper and lower teeth will be affected by this joint. Each one will affect on the other negatively and positively. So we study this joint. The temporomandibular joint represents the joint between the head of the condyle of the mandible and the mandibular fossa or the glenoid fossa of the temporal bone of the skull, and both of them will be articulated with each other through the articular disc in between them. This articular disc will divide the temporomandibular joint or the synovial cavity into superior compartment represented by the red color, superior synovial cavity, and inferior synovial cavity. This is another cross section of the temporomandibular joint, which represents or will show us the synovial cavity of the temporomandibular joint, which is divided by the articular disc represented by the blue color into superior compartments of the synovial cavity represented by the red color and inferior compartment represented by the red color also. Now we come to the temporomandibular ligaments that are related to the temporomandibular joint. We have the temporomandibular and capsular ligaments, like it is clear. We have a stylomandibular ligament and a sphenomandibular ligament. Sure, it is clear from name that the stylomandibular ligaments connect the styloid process with the mandible, and therefore it is called stylomandibular ligament, and also the sphenomandibular ligament connect the sphenoid bone as it is shown with the mandible, and therefore it is called sphenomandibular ligament. Now we come to the muscles that control the mandibular movement, that is called the muscles of mastication. These are four muscles: temporalis, masseter, lateral pterygoid, and medial pterygoid muscles. We can classify the muscles that control the mandibular movement into three groups: closing group or closing muscles, gliding group, opening, and opening muscles. According to the closing group, the masseter muscle, temporalis, and medial pterygoid muscles are responsible for pulling the mandible against the maxilla, responsible for elevating and closing the mandible against the maxilla. These are the masseter, temporalis, and medial pterygoid muscle. Whereas the lateral pterygoid muscles connect the mandible to the lateral pterygoid plate in such a way as to act as a steering mechanism. Steering mechanism مثل السكان، lateral movement. Steering mechanism for lateral movement of the mandible. And act to protrude the jaw or to move it laterally. هذه according to lateral movement. Then lateral movement of the mandible responsible or controlled by lateral pterygoid muscle. While the muscles that depress the mandible or opening the mouth consist of three groups, اللي هي suprahyoid muscle, infrahyoid muscle, platysma muscle, and also lateral pterygoid muscle play a role in that. إذن نستشف من هذا أنه lower jaw connected with the upper jaw through the temporomandibular joint and through the occlusion between upper and lower teeth, like you see. And the movement of the mandible will be controlled by the muscles of mastication. Now we come to the mandibular movement and mandibular axis. The mandibular movement could be classified into two main types or groups. هي basic movements والfunctional movement. basic movements تشمل rotational movements والtranslatory or gliding movements. هذه movements ليش سميناها basic? Because it takes place at the level of the temporomandibular joint and it represents the terminal hinge movements. يعني takes place around a specific axis. تحصل بمستوى واحد حول محور واضح، حول محور دوران الآن راح نناقشه اللي هو 3 mandibular axis. إذا النوع الأول من المانديبولار موفمنت اللي نسميه البيسك موفمنتس واللي يشمل لنا الروتيشنال موفمنتس والجلايدنج موفمنت أو الترانسلاتوري موفمنت أو الحركة الانزلاقية. مثل ما ذكرنا these two types اللي هي rotational والgliding تمثل البيسك movements of the mandible because takes place within the level of the temporomandibular joint. يعني ما بيها حركة in 3 dimensions، مو حركة مركبة. النوع الثاني اللي هو functional movements. ليش سميناه بالfunctional movements؟ all the mandibular movement except the terminal hinge movements اللي هي البيسك والrotational باستثناء الروتيشنال والتيرمينال اور جلايدنج موفمنتس هي الفانكشنال موفمنت واللي هي تعتبر combination from the rotational and the translatory movement. إذن المانديبولار موفمنت تقسم إلى basic movements وfunctional movement. البيسك موفمنت تشمل لنا الروتيشنال موفمنت والترانسلاتوري موفمنتس واللي تعتبر terminal hinge movements بمستوى واحد. When there is a combination between the rotational and translatory movement there will be a functional movement. الفانكشنال موفمنت تمثل هي حركة مركبة تتكون من الروتيشنال موفمنت والبيسك موفمنت. يعني على سبيل المثال during eating من نتناول الطعام أثناء تناول الطعام there will be a functional movement of the mandible لأنه الماندبل ده يتحرك بمستويات مختلفة in more than one dimension، فلذلك نسميها functional movement. لكن على سبيل المثال during opening and closing of the mouth the mandible will have a rotational movement because it is move around hinge axis or transverse axis. Now we come to the rotational movement which can occur in around 3 axes in 3 levels. يعني rotational movement قد تحصل in 3 dimensions around 3 axes. يعني مو in 3 dimensions at the same time وإنما in 3 levels or in 3 dimensions in each dimension around a specific axis. أكرر مو at the same time. لما نقول rotational movement يعني terminal hinge movement يعني دوران الماندبل حول محور محدد ثابت في مستوى ثابت. So we have 3 axes around which the rotational movement can occur. The first axis is called the terminal hinge axis or the horizontal axis اللي نشوفها على اليمين. Then the hinge axis of the mandible or the transverse horizontal axis, it is an imaginary line around which the mandible rotates within the sagittal plane during opening and closing. ولذلك سميناها rotational movement because it takes place around terminal specific hinge axis in one level. هذا in one plane or level. هذا الأول plane اللي هو قلنا sagittal plane through which the mandible rotates around the hinge axis. الأكسس الآخر على اليسار اللي هو sagittal axis اللي هو imaginary line around which the mandible rotates within the frontal plane وهي النوع الثاني من rotational movement اللي هي rotation of the mandible within the frontal plane around the sagittal axis. الأكسس الثالث اللي الصورة بالأسفل اللي هو vertical axis around it is an imaginary line around which the mandible rotates within the horizontal plane إذا النوع الثالث من rotational movement of the mandible هي within the horizontal plane around the vertical axis. إذا هذه rotational movements will take place around a specific three axes within one level. Three axes, three levels or three planes. فهذه الروتيشنال موفمنت قلنا النوع وتعتبر هي بيسك موفمنت. النوع الاخر من البيسك موفمنت هو الترانسلاتوري او الجلايدنج موفمنت، الحركه الانزلاقيه. عندما تندمج هذه الحركتين بشكل معقد، يعني البيسك الروتيشنال موفمنت والترانسلاتوري موفمنت will takes place at the same time، راح تطلع عندنا الفانكشنال موفمنت. مثل ما قلنا الفانكشنال موفمنت اللي هي حركه مركبه واكثر تعقيدا، وعلى سبيل المثال من تحصل during mastication يتحرك الماندبل in more than one plane، ولذلك it is called functional movement. هذا سلايد آخر يوضح لنا movement around or about the horizontal hinge axis as seen in a hinge axis opening، يعني terminal hinge axis around the transverse horizontal axis in opening and closing. هذا سلايد آخر يوضح لنا sagittal axis of rotation in which the mandibular movement around the sagittal axis occurs within طبعا the frontal view when one condyle moves inferiorly while the other remain in the terminal hinge position. طبعا احنا قلنا هذه ال rotational movements هي basic movements occurs within a specific levels around a specific axis. قلنا الفانكشنال موفمنتس هي حركات مركبة من الروتيشنال موفمنت والترانسلاتوري موفمنت. وطبعا احنا من الفانكشنال موفمنت ايضا including opening and closing movement, symmetrical forward and backward movement, asymmetrical sidewise movement or lateral movement. لكن من نقول الاوبننج اند closing movement بالفانكشنال موفمنت هي مو مثل الاوبننج اند closing بالروتيشنال موفمنت. هنا الاوبننج اند كلوزنج موفمنت بالفانكشنال موفمنت تكون مركبه وليس around terminal hinge axis مثل الروتيشنال موفمنت. الى هنا ناتي الى نهايه محاضرتنا لهذا اليوم، والسلام عليكم ورحمه الله وبركاته.